Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Thank you so much for joining us. Well, tonight we will spend this hour talking about, of course, Ferguson, Missouri, where authorities waiting to see what happens next. We're going to now take you out to Missouri. We're going to get a live report here with Marcy Gonzalez. She joins us now with the very latest.
Good evening. The protests we've seen so far today have been peaceful, but people here are still angry about the violence last night, and they are still fuming that Officer Darren Wilson wasn't charged.
His actions triggered outrage from coast to coast. Shut it down! And today, for the first time, Officer Darren Wilson is talking publicly about the day he shot and killed unarmed teenager Michael Brown, telling ABC's George Stephanopoulos in an exclusive interview that while he is sorry, he would not have done anything differently. Wilson remains in hiding, where yesterday he learned a grand jury decided not to indict him. The announcement sparked violent protests in and around Ferguson, Missouri. Masked demonstrators burned businesses to the ground. They threw rocks and bottles at police. Officers responded with tear gas. Today, disgust and disbelief as the community comes together to patch up some of the destruction.
I'm not angry, I'm disappointed.
I agree with you.
I'm very disappointed.
And Michael Brown's family, through their attorney, shared their own disappointment, angry with how the case that sparked the unrest was handled.
We object publicly and loudly as we can on behalf of Michael Brown Jr.'s family that this process is broken.
And a lot of people here are worried that the rioting could happen again tonight, but the governor insists that law enforcement is ready. He explains there will be more than 2,000 National Guard troops out on the streets tonight, and that's a big increase from what they had here last night. Live in Ferguson, Missouri, Marcy Gonzalez, ABC News. Now back to you.
Thank you, Marcy. Now, last night, in an address to the nation, President Obama urged activists and community leaders to try and conduct peaceful protests, not resort to violence. Literally, that message delivered as the streets were on fire in Ferguson, falling on deaf ears, angry protesters taking to the streets, destroying nearly everything in certain paths. Other leaders like Jesse Jackson, Al Sharpton also spoke out after the decision came down.
No probable cause exists to file any charge against Officer Wilson.
I'd like to reiterate my call for peace, respect, and restraint.
First and foremost, we are a nation built on the rule of law. And so we need to accept that this decision was the grand jury's to make. Hurting others or destroying property is not the answer.
What I've seen tonight is probably much worse than the worst night we ever had in August.
I'm really disappointed in the lack of an indictment, but we have to take heed of the words of the father of Michael Brown, who said to do so in a peaceful way.
Those that got violent last night, those that acted in a destructive manner, does not represent the spirit of Michael Brown.
Tonight is a sad commentary of an historical pattern. Unarmed black teen shot and killed, and it is seen as justifiable homicide.
Now, protesters across the country today in New York, Chicago, D.C., L.A., and other cities, they took the streets to speak out against the grand jury's decision not to indict Wilson.
The black men can just get shot down like dogs. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
I think it's a catastrophe. It goes against everything as far as justice is concerned. And I think it's a complete embarrassment to American justice.
It sends a very chilling message to young black men, particularly in the United States of America, that their lives do not matter.
Now, the attorney for Michael Brown's family, Benjamin Crump, he criticized the St. Louis County prosecutor's decision to call a grand jury instead of appointing a special prosecutor to the case. Reverend Sharpton echoed that, also saying the prosecutor went out of his way to discredit Brown. Today, the mayor of Ferguson also expressed frustration. He says the National Guard wasn't deployed quickly enough to counter violent protests across the city. A whole lot of disappointment, a whole lot of anger today, a whole lot of frustration. And I want to bring in our panel This evening, we're joined by Owen Williams, who is the pastor of the St. Mark Missionary Baptist Church in Queens. Dominic Carter, of course, our political journalist and author. Nick Casal, private investigator and former NYPD detective. And Andrew Whitman, our senior political correspondent. And what I'd like to do at home, as well as here, is have a conversation tonight. Tomorrow, as we do on Wednesdays, we're going to bring in our legal panel. We'll get into all the legalities about how the case was tried, the process, what could go on from here. And there's two very high-profile cases right in the New York metropolitan area that are going to be in the docket not too long from now. We'll talk about that as well. But tonight, I want to talk about policing. I want to talk about reaction. I want to talk about race and both police and race injustices that exist in the system. I'm going to bring you at home into our conversation as well. Our toll-free lines are going to be open. We're going to tell you how to get involved both there and online in a minute. But first, and I'll start with you, Pastor. You're sitting at home. We're waiting for the decision. We're waiting for the decision. For some reason, they wait until the wee hours of the night here to decide to chair the decision. It comes down. What was your reaction, and then what was your reaction as you saw the events unfold last night?
Good evening, Richard. How are you? I decided I was going to come here tonight and try to speak as truthfully as possible about this situation and event, and not to add to the hysteria of what's been happening. The decision did not affect me. It was an expected decision that would come down. I expected that would happen. I feel that the prosecutors, good, bad, or indifferent, it's not my call. There is a mindset in American law enforcement and criminal justice that you need to hold a certain segment of the police force, whoever, as perfect and infallible, even when they're wrong, because it's a us against them kind of mentality. Because if we show that someone is wrong, then that's a clinch in the armor, and it can be used, so on and so on and so on. So from that aspect, I felt that they could have done a little more better job on that piece. The events happening after, totally unqualified. Criminality is never supported. And if you want to deal with truth tonight, we can get into why these things are happening.
And I'll ask you on Sunday. You're going to have, I'm sure, a lot of congregants. This is going to be the subject that people are going to want to talk about and put it in context. Would you say there's frustration, resignation? How would you describe the mood? You're going to have a better sense on who fills the pews on Sunday, but how would you describe the mood of your community?
Anemic, frustration, don't care anymore, these kinds of things, anger. But my statement, if I give it any conversation, my statement to this will be that if you want to get to the bottom of this, you're dealing with perspectives, and detective can correct me on this. Law enforcement, I always said, and I said last time we were here about this, their philosophy in policing is in two pillars: protect and serve, enforce the law, and that is decided discretionally based on the communities you're in.
We'll get into that one tonight. And Dominic, you also, before last night came down, weren't surprised. You didn't think that we were going to see an indictment.
I knew there wasn't going to be an indictment. Didn't think. I knew it wasn't going to be an indictment.
All right, well, you knew there wasn't.
Okay.
My point is, again, obviously you're not surprised today. But obviously you've had conversations before we went on air tonight. How would you characterize, in the aftermath of what we saw last night, been there, done that? We've seen this scene before. Is it different this time?
I think if you're asking me the perspective, Richard, of the African American community or progressive people, people of goodwill, they're very upset. They feel that the deck is stacked, that there is no justice, that prosecutors are an extension of the police department, and there are just a lot of angry people. And if you look at this from a historical point of view, there is a sentiment tonight in communities of color around the country that the only way you're going to get justice, in this case, perhaps in Eric Garner and others, is that the feds have to get involved. And so we don't know what's going to happen as it relates to that.
We don't, and we heard the Attorney General earlier today, Andrew, said that they're looking into it, but they gave no sense as to, and if you look at how, if there was federal, and there is a federal inquiry, how it would work, it's a really high threshold. But more from a visceral level, I at least looked at last night as continued missed opportunities throughout it. From we can debate, and maybe that's a tomorrow conversation, how the process played out, opportunities maybe on, and we'll talk, with Nick about this, that maybe there was the original encounter on the street could have been different, how this was communicated to the public, when this was communicated to the public, the response after this was read. We've covered stories like this before, but it just seemed like a series of things that it didn't have to be this way.
It's the emotion for me was just incredible sadness throughout all of this, not just because of what happened in August and the unfortunate turn of events there, but it seemed like that process continued right up through yesterday with the timing of the decision, with and again for tomorrow, the prosecutor and his approach to the grand jury, to the reaction among the people in Ferguson. I was also left with the takeaway that this is going to happen again. We're going to keep reporting on this. There will be another Ferguson. There will be another Trayvon Martin. There will be another Eric Garner case. These will keep happening until something puts a wrench into the gears and stops this seemingly inevitable process from happening.
You're a veteran of the force here. We've seen scenes turn ugly before. We've seen controversial shootings before. We've seen racial shootings before. Did this feel any different, or did you remember back to, I remember this from the 70s, the 80s? Did this unfortunately have a familiar vibe?
I think it's outrageous to compare this to Trayvon Martin, because Zimmerman was not a police officer, nor was he acting under the law. So I think we should just totally discard that. What we have here is the issue of law, and we accept, we all understand and accept the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Missouri. And there was due process. And I think that the grand jurors came to a reasonable conclusion. And that conclusion we have to accept, right, wrong, or indifferent. Now, if we want to just keep changing the deck of cards until we get a decision we want, we're doing ourselves a disjustice.
Do you do me a favor, though, Nick, and say there has been many criticisms, and not just from the streets of Ferguson, that the way that this was prosecuted and the way that the prosecutor laid out the case, and I'm not trying to have a legal conversation as much tonight, but that's different than a lot of prosecutions, and you've been involved in cases where the prosecutors—
I've been before the grand jury many times.
They've gone directly to the grand jury and they state their case. They state the case they're trying to prove, and they make it clear what side they stand on. This wasn't the case in this one, and a lot of people in the community of Ferguson say, why is it different for Mr. Brown than it was for the vast majority of grand jury cases that are presented?
In prior cases, we didn't accept what the grand jury had determined. And we said it was skewed because not enough evidence was put in before the grand jury. Now you have someone who did not go by the rule books. He rewrote what he was going to do. He took everything and put it in, and now we have the grand jury come back and vote a no true bill. So, I mean, what do we want? Do we want what we emotionally believe should happen, or do we want the rule of law?
Okay, well, it's a perfect segue, because when we come back from break here, I'm going to talk about, and as we said, and the guest has said, you want us to be real, and that's what the purpose of this hour will be, race and policing and race and the law. Where are we right now in America in 2014? And I'm going to get your take on this as well at home. You can go to Facebook and Twitter and sound off. And also, we're going to open up our phone lines to you. And the question's the same on whatever platform you're joining us on. What are your thoughts post that decision? The toll-free number is 38766-2428. Please join us. We'll be right back.